Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this session, which is titled Collective Action, Community Approaches in Scholarly Communications. So I'm your moderator for this session. I'm Lou Woodley, and I was excited to be invited to come along to this because I actually get to spend most of my job thinking about scientific community building. So I do that as director of the new AAAS Centre for Scientific Collaboration and Community Engagement. And the Centre is both a research and training institute that aims to support the people who are building communities within science. So who is that? What does that mean? So that could be folks who are working for associations, for infrastructure organisations who are trying to have more engaged relationships with their membership. It might also be scientific collaborations. So we see that as research collaborations get more complicated, they span different disciplines, they span across the globe. So you need human infrastructure to empower those collaborations to really make the most of their time together. And so we provide a range of activities to support people and organisations interested in that human infrastructure. So just a quick plug, one of the things that we have going on next year is that we run an annual fellowship programme. So we run a fellowship that trains the people doing community building within science. So if that's something that you do or something that your colleagues are doing in any of those configurations that I've just described, then we'd be very happy to hear from you. You can check that out on the Centre website, and the closing date for the applications is November the 18th. Okay, so that was enough about me and why I'm excited to be here. We'd actually like to know a little bit about you and the expertise, the experience that we actually have in the room today. So we were going to do this by a show of hands, which I think we can still do. But then I think it would actually be quite nice just to go around and have very quick intros and just hear where exactly you're coming from. So first of all, how many of you belong to what you would describe as a scholarly communications community? So community of practice, working group, some other collaboration. Okay, so is that sort of, okay. And how many of you would say that you belong to more than one of those? Yeah, okay. And then how many of you are actually doing the convening, doing the community building as part of your day job? And then is anybody doing it as a side hustle? Right, okay, great. So why don't, we're given, there's only a few of us, why don't we start over here and just tell us a little bit, yeah, where are you from? What are the scholarly communications communities that you have in mind that you participate in? Great, okay, nice to meet you.
Both were.
Yeah, you get friendly.
You could all sort of move closer to the microphone. Well, you can't move too far forward because we don't know how much cord we'll get. Oh, I see. We'll just move forward. No,
Yeah, see, this is the
Yeah.
fireside.
Gotcha.
Right,
Right, there we
brilliant.
go.
Yeah.
So for those that couldn't hear me, Nina Collins, I'm with Purdue University Press, a division of Purdue Libraries. I'm trained as a librarian. I do all the open access outreach for Purdue Libraries, but I'm also with the press, so I manage the institutional repository and offer a lot of publishing consultations to Purdue affiliates.
And do you bring any specific questions here today? Is there anything particularly on your mind community-wise?
No.
Great. No is a valid
I'm
answer.
here to be a sponge.
Okay, all good.
Hello, I'm Jean Shipman, VP for Global Library Relations with Elsevier, but a librarian by training, 37 years of practice, so I think I qualify in librarianship. And I love my communities from my library world as well as ones I'm making in the, I won't say publishing world, but the more commercial world. And I'm here to think about how to create even more communities as we are working together, hopefully, in the future to create the whole scholarly communications future.
So can you describe one of the communities that you belong to?
SSP, for one, MLA, ALA, SLA, UKSG.
All the acronyms.
Yeah, all the above. Just trying to keep, the circle of communications open. So.
Great.
I'm Alexa Colella. I'm from the University of Illinois Press. I'm the journal's marketing manager. I was not prepared to contribute to the conversation. Yeah, thanks guys. So one of my sort of like main concerns in my job is how to like just bring the people in our scholarly societies together and have some sort of articulated goals, because we have a lot of really intersectional journals that I think get a little disenfranchised by automated bias. And that's kind of been one of my pet projects, and trying to reach out to those societies and help them develop some teamed goals for citing and access and assigning. Ethnomusicology, the journal, is one of the ones that I've been working most heavily on for that. I'm not articulating this well, but anyway.
It's fine. And so what have you done so far in that space? Have you actually convened folks, or are these via webinars, conversations?
Right now, it's a lot of convincing them that they have work to do.
Okay.
So I'm trying to get them to reword a lot of their materials towards intersectionality and multidisciplinary, things like that, and then also reach out to their community members to articulate those same things.
So really at the sort of strategic formulation stage, so getting folks to even think about a community
Yeah,
strategy.
and using communities as strategic amplifier of scholarly materials.
Okay, brilliant.
Make it back that way. My name is Amy Harris, and I'm with the MIT Press. What I do in my job is kind of ambiguously named, institutional marketing, but I'm very heavily involved with our journals program, especially marketing related to the open access journals, and also have been thinking a lot about how to support the KFG, Knowledge Futures Group, which is an initiative at the MIT Press to develop open source, open access technologies. Also, one of their projects in collaboration with ASAP Bio is to develop more open science tools. And actually elsewhere, my colleagues are presenting about PubPub and the underlay, which are items that are being incubated there. But I'm just curious to know about how others are dealing with, specific other scholarly communities are dealing with that kind of work.
And ASAP Bio has a brand new community manager now as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, thank you. My name is Janice Kuda, and I am the new Business Development Director for Chorus. And I'm not here just because of Howard. I'm here because I know most of the speakers on the panel, and I have high regard for them and wanted to come and learn as much as I can in this new position. I'm working with Chorus and the small team and our working groups to help increase our visibility and impact on the communities that we work with, researchers, publishers, institutions.
Great.
Please come.
Yeah, welcome, welcome. We're very friendly. So we've just been doing introductions and really, if you'd like to say a few words about who you are, where you're from, and then do you already belong to a scholarly communications community? And no is a perfectly valid answer.
Hi,
Hi there.
my name is Stephanie. I work at the University of Michigan Library. Am I part of a scholarly communications community? I think so. I'm really curious what that has meant to other people.
And that's something we're going to get to. Yeah.
But I work with a lot of people whose work is in scholarly communications, and I work on accessibility. So that's one aspect that I focus on when I collaborate with folks at my institution.
And do you bring any specific questions here today, or just a curiosity to find out more?
Curiosity.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm sure, as we're all aware, community is one of those words that we're seeing everywhere these days, right? We can look at, websites of infrastructure organisations, publishers, technology sites, things in the corporate sector, and that C word is everywhere. But are we all saying the same thing? What do we even mean when we talk about community? So if you look in the business pages, you look into things like HBR, and you'll hear that community is your business's competitive advantage. I've heard various conversations this month where folks are using the phrase by, for, and of the community is the new approach to, and then insert your favourite things. So that could be innovation, science communication. There was even an interesting thread on Twitter yesterday about community roots for political journalism. But I think what perhaps some of that doesn't quite get to is the things that we experience as members of a community. So the fact that we know that communities can be a way of scaling our activities, they can be a way of helping us to do more. And so this phrase, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much, I think resonates, at least for me. And I think as well as being able to do more, I think when you're actually a member of a productive community, there's a momentum that comes with that, a sense of purpose and perhaps even a sense of belonging. So Meg Wheatley, who is a systems thinker, says, there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. So what we're going to do today is explore a little bit about what we mean by community in scholarly communications, but we didn't want to do all the talking. We'd much prefer to have a dialogue with you and to explore this together. So we decided when talking about this session that we would limit the 4 speakers here to just 3 slides. And then we're going to use those 3 slides to answer 3 questions. The first question is to dig a bit deeper into what does community mean to you and your organisation? So we can explore that. The second question is, how is your community approach unique? So this is really the slide where they get to tell you about the initiatives that they're working on and perhaps some unique challenges that they're using community to address. And then the final slide is really meant to be a jumping off point for us to continue the conversations. So we just asked you whether you bring any specific questions to this session. They've also been asked, what's on your mind at the moment from a community perspective? And so the way that we're going to do this is that I'll introduce each speaker one by one. They're going to present their 3 slides, and then we're going to open up things for discussion and see where this goes. And you should feel free to think about these questions, obviously, as they raise them, and then we can have a discussion at the end about them. But if there's anything else that occurs to you as you're hearing about these projects or thinking about the community topic, then we're going to have plenty of time to talk about that as well. Okay, so let's get started. So first up, we have Howard. So Howard Ratner is the Executive Director of Chorus. And so over the past couple of decades, he's played a key role in developing innovative technology solutions that have transformed scholarly communications. So he co-founded and chaired ORCID. He was active in the establishment of the Digital Object Identifier, the DOI, and was instrumental in the founding and technical development of Crossref and of clocks. He's been president of the SSP, he served on the board for several years. He's also co-chair of the Metadata 2020 Best Practices. So as we can tell, restricting Howard to 4 slides is key to keep this on track, and so I'd like to hand over. And Howard, it's your turn.
Thank you, Lou. So let's get into this. So first off, as Lou already said, I've been involved in a lot of various different community projects, all of them while I was at various different jobs. So first one I got involved with when I was at Springer. Those days it was called Springer Verlag. And then later on, when I joined the Nature Publishing Group, I got involved in even more. Because one of the things I always found about being involved with community type things is that you learn, right? And you could learning outside of your own little ivory tower, and that was really important. So, but this is the first time that actually I'm involved in a community effort where actually they pay me, right? I'm actually paid by this. So for me and Chorus, what does community mean? Well, first off, Chorus started in 2013 by a few publishers getting together, trying to figure out how to answer the John Holdren memo that was issued about public access here in the United States. So it was all about gathering together those publishers and trying to figure out, and that was not easy, what did they want to do about this? What did they want to achieve? And there was all sorts of ideas. I started out as a consultant with them, and then later on became their executive director. One of the other things that came out of that was, okay, well, we wanted to deal with the US agencies. So that was another community, getting to know that community, getting to understand that community. And I'm very happy to say that Chorus has actually pulled together various different, as you can see here, various different funders in the United States, such as USDA is there, and NSF, and DOE, as well as the DOD. And as you can imagine, the Department of Defense has very different needs and wants than the USDA. Okay, just as a short example. But then it was how do you broaden this from the small organizations like USAID to the larger organizations like NSF, and then how do you broaden it even further to go outside the United States, like the Japan Science and Technology Agency, as well as we've also done a pilot with the ARC in Australia. So all of these are different communities, understanding the different communities, and most importantly, and this came from actually our Metadata 2020 talk, getting them to talk the same language. When I was taking my very first meetings with some of these agencies, they said, what's a DOI? Right, and I just said, because I had been talking, and I said, DOIs, and we connect by DOIs, and the person put their hand up and said, well, what's a DOI? So getting the people to talk in this, if you will, Babylon of communities is really important, and getting them all on that same page. And then most recently, and by most recently I mean last Charleston, we announced that we have institutional memberships to Chorus too. So University of Florida and University of Denver were amongst our pilot partners there, as well as Chiba University out in Japan. And then later on, we brought in La Trobe and Johns Hopkins. But they too spoke different languages also about different metadata and different terms and had different needs and wants. So for me, though, this was trying to figure out, okay, I've got these stakeholders, which are my institutions, my funders, the public, the researchers, and the publishers. Those are the stakeholders, and we've managed to attract them. But what do they all want? And when we figured it out, we feel that they all want, most importantly, they want a better way to do compliance with these funder mandates. They also obviously want to be able to identify the metadata and the articles that are beholden to these plans. They also want to make sure that their articles are discoverable. They want to make sure that the access is appropriate to these articles. And ultimately, because many, especially in this institution space, they want to make sure that these articles are preserved for perpetuity. So that's why we also have engagements with clocks, as you'll see in my next slide. So then when you think about all of that and pulling it all together, it's really important to figure out, well, what are you going to do with it? Because I think it's great to pull communities together, but they need a purpose, right? And they need to be able to say that they've contributed. So one of the things that they do in my space is they actually all do contribute to some level metadata and or just information and or conversation. So starting at 12 o'clock on this particular clock, you can see that we gather information directly from Crossref. But first to note is that publishers have already submitted their content DOIs and their funder ID information into Crossref. So they've already done something into the community space, right? And then next up, though, is we then use those very same content DOIs to see whether or not it's been preserved at clocks in Portico, okay? So we pull that into our database. But then equally now, we've got all these government portals that have been created in NSF and USGS, and obviously the big one in NIH, but also the Department of Energy. So if we put up the funder ID and content DOI and we put it up against their portals, can we pull down to see information to see whether or not these articles are available in those portals? And the answer is actually yes. And then are some government agencies actually making their grant IDs or their grants publicly accessible? And the answer for NSF is yes. So actually, if you send in the funder ID and the content DOI to NSF, you can get back the link to their grant information. And then I should not leave out, especially ORCID here. So Alice will talk more about ORCID, I'm sure. But one of the things that's very important is we want to make it so that our metadata, because we are not a content repository, we are a metadata repository. We are a discovery layer. We're trying to make things transparent. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is take another persistent identifier, like the ORCID identifier, and be able to link up from the data that we have from all the various different authors that we have amongst our metadata and get back the author profile, the researcher information that ORCID has. And the last thing that we've done this spring is we've actually said, well, this is all great, we link to content, but what about the data, right? And we were trying this for about 2 years and we were not very successful until Scholix came along. And so Scholix has enabled us through their connection between DataCite and Crossref and Pangaya and OpenAir and a few others. What they allow us to do is by sending in the content DOI to their database, we get back the data set DOIs, and so we can link out to the data sets, the relevant data sets as well. So pulling all that together, for me, has pulled together this metadata community. And then in turn, by the way, it's also shown up all the various different holes and skeletons that appear in all these various different closets, which means that I'm very involved with the Metadata 2020 initiative. But for me, the question that I want you to simmer on while the other speakers are talking is, what was the best outcome of a community-led effort, and in particular, why was it successful? And I think Lou will come back to these questions at the very end. So thanks.
So thanks very much, Howard. What's interesting about this is that when we teach community theory as part of the program that I run, we talk about sitting down, almost creating a Venn diagram to work out where your community actually is. So sort of identifying the different stakeholders that you want to interact with and finding that shared value, that shared purpose in that overlap of the Venn. And so I think the second slide there exactly captures that. And I think what's also interesting in this space at the moment is often when we do that Venn diagram, we're talking about individuals and then we're bringing those individuals together. What we're actually seeing here is actually other communities. So we're almost getting that one level higher now and seeing communities of communities. And that brings us on really nicely to our second speaker, which is Alice Meadows. So Alice is the Director of Communications at ORCID, and she's responsible for developing and implementing ORCID's communications plan. She's also responsible for broadening the awareness of the organisation and of its stakeholders and its audiences. And then, like everybody else, she also works with a number of other initiatives in scholarly communications. So that also includes the Metadata 2020 initiative, and then the recently established C4DISC, which is the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications. And then there's a soon-to-be-launched cross-community campaign for wider adoption and use of persistent identifiers. So over to you, Alice.
I feel like we're doing a little jig up there. Okay, so I have chosen to take a slightly different approach to this and to Lou's original question about which scholarly communications communities are we part of and which are sort of work ones and which are outside of work. I thought I would choose one which is very much a work one, it's my job, and one which is an outside of my day job kind of community that I'm involved in, to give you sort of two different, slightly different feels. I'm also, actually, as Lou mentioned, involved in Metadata 2020, but that's going to be very well covered by Scott in a minute, so don't need to go there. And that would be a good example for me of a work, something that I do with my professional hat on. And part of the reason I thought this would be interesting is because although obviously there's a lot of, community in some ways means a lot of the same things, depending on sort of what that community is, and I think in particular where it is in terms of its development, different things may come to the fore. So ORCID is still a relatively new organisation. We were founded about 6 years ago, but we're fairly well established. We've become fairly well established in that time. So the things for that community means for ORCID, first, it's really central. We are a community-led organisation. Without our community, we are nothing. You literally do, everything for us, really. We support and involve you, but, you guys are our members. You pay my salary, thank you. But also, and really, really importantly, you implement ORCID in your systems, and that's what will help achieve our vision. What we want to get to is a world where everyone who contributes in any way to research and scholarship is uniquely identified using their ORCID identifier, but also connected with their works and their contributions and their affiliations. And that's really where you come in. The researchers can get their ORCID ID free of charge, and 5.5 million of them has done so, but it's only by you implementing ORCID in your systems and allowing them to use their ORCID identifier, that's what enables those connections that make that vision a reality. So we also like to think that, I suppose following on from the same thing, you're central to what we do. We're community-led. We have a community-led board, but you're also essential. As I say, we couldn't do this without you. We're a small 30-person global not-for-profit. So our community is absolutely essential to us. And then this is by no means an exhaustive list, but the third thing that I think is really important is that we are inclusive. And I think this came up, maybe you alluded a little bit to it, Jean. You know, we see ourselves as a neutral, trusted partner. We don't take sides on the sort of commercial versus not-for-profit front because, frankly, we need everybody in the tent. We don't want it to be a them and us kind of community. We want ORCID to be an inclusive community. So those are the three words that I came up with when trying to think about what does community mean to ORCID. C4DISC stands for the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications, and this is a recently launched initiative that some of you may have seen. So this is very different. This is a community that's at the start of its evolution. So it's new, and at the moment we have way more questions than answers about what that means for us as a community. We're still figuring it out. There are also some questions around leadership. This is it's an organisation at the moment of industry organisations, so it was kind of kicked off by SSP, the Society for Scholarly Publishing. There are now 9 other organisations, founding organisations, and there's a number of others that are starting to get involved. But you know, what does that mean in terms of the leadership of the community? I don't know. SSP is sort of doing the groundwork, and maybe that will continue to be the case, but maybe it won't. At what point do we evolve from this kind of very organic, small, you know, very community-led organisation into something that has a different kind of leadership? And then again, I think that inclusivity is very important to C4DISC. You know, we're about diversity and inclusion, so we need to eat our own dog food, which is rather apparently techie, disgusting way of saying, you know, we need to practice what we preach. So I think what it's a horrid expression.
Yeah.
But I've been told it's okay to use it by our technical people.
But we've used it so many times we're like desensitized.
Oh, not yet. But yes, so I think when I was doing this, I was struck by the fact that actually the inclusive thing for me is quite important, I think, in terms of thinking about community, because a community that is exclusive and doesn't want to involve certain types of people or certain types of organisation, I think is going to be the weaker for it. So I think that's where I got to on this slide. And I think, again, the theme here is really that whatever the situation, a community is a group of people or organisations that are engaging around a common cause. So what are our unique challenges? Again, quite different, and I've sort of alluded to some of them already, really, but for ORCID, and I suspect this may not be an American expression, but it's a British expression, which Lou at least will understand, which is this theory, this sort of idea of jam tomorrow. So, you know, you're kind of paying up front, you need to do the work up front, and it requires this leap of faith. So one of the things about ORCID that honestly I didn't realise until I joined the organisation was that it's not just about getting an ORCID ID, it's not just about becoming a member. There's this sort of upfront investment, and that's the sort of the second challenge. So it's more than just a membership. We won't succeed if people just support us financially. That's great, we need it, we love it, but it's so much more than that. And in turn, what that means is that it's complex. What we're doing, what we're selling isn't straightforward. It's not, you know, you give me your money and I'll give you this and we're done. It's a transactional arrangement. It's much more than that. It's about getting people engaged. It's about making sure that our messaging works to get both researchers and organisations and technical people and CEOs engaged and understanding what we're trying to do and bought into doing it. It means, you know, investing in technology. So it's a complex, not difficult, but it's not a straightforward thing, ORCID, as it turns out. And so I think that's our kind of unique challenge. For C4DISC, the challenges are much more around the fact that it's new. So we haven't quite defined our goals yet. We have a sort of overall goal, which is, you know, we want scholarly communications to be more diverse and inclusive. Well, who wouldn't want that? That's a great goal, but we need to, and we've defined it a bit more clearly than that, but we don't really know what that's going to look like. So we know we want to do some work around establishing some baselines. We know we want people to sign up to our joint statement of principles, but there's a lot more that we need to figure out. And we need to reach consensus, and that's difficult as well. We have all these, you know, industry organisations who sit at very different places on the spectrum between being, you know, super open and, you know, very, very pro-open access, very anti-commercial publishers at one end, to the sort of, at the other end of the spectrum, where you have people who are very much supported by those kind of organisations that are, less popular with the other. And so, how you come to a consensus, and the individuals running those organisations or representing them are responsible for representing their members, some of whom overlap, but not all of whom. So it's reaching consensus is challenging. I think we're making good progress, but it's challenging. And then, of course, there's going to be the sustainability issue. We don't yet know how this is going to be funded. We know we're going to need some sort of funding, but who's going to provide that? How is the governance going to work? So lots and lots of questions. So our challenges there are more around how are we actually going to make this thing work, whereas with ORCID, we've got something, but we need to get people to buy into it. In both cases, I think building trust is really, really critical. And then my question for you guys is, how can we get better at bringing existing communities together rather than constantly creating new ones? Because one of my bugbears is we keep focusing on what the differences are and setting up new, whether it's a new tool or a new service or a new group or a new association, because, we're a little bit different from these people, so we need to do something on our own. And actually, as I started off saying, I think we have way more in common than we have differences, and we are more powerful if we're inclusive. So that's what I would like to get your feedback on that.
Great, so thank you very much, Alice. So I think one of the really great points there, that again is the language that we often use when we're talking about communities, is that communities really give you that opportunity to go from purely transactional interactions to the transformative. But that is hard work, that integration of different perspectives, of different terminologies, people just coming and bringing, different backgrounds to the table, involves an integration and an alignment that is actually difficult and sometimes invisible work. So that brings us very nicely next on to Scott. So Scott Pluchak is now retired from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and like all busy brains, that means that he hasn't actually stopped doing things. He's leading the Defining the Terms We Use About Metadata project of the Metadata 2020 initiative. So we now get to hear about that initiative. He's also the founding member of the Chicago Collaborative, which is a group that's dedicated to finding common ground among the librarian, publisher, and editorial communities. So again, that Venn diagram again. And is the chair of the steering committee for the Open Scholarship Initiative. And that's a UNESCO-sponsored global convention featuring all stakeholders in scholarly communication.
I'm good. Thank you, Lou. Okay, so when I looked at the first question, after we'd had our organizing talk, what does community mean? I realized it's one of these words that we tend to throw around all the time, and I didn't actually have a good definition. So what does community mean, and how do I sort of launch into the talk from this? And looking at definitions and the ways the term's been used, it's this group of people with broadly shared interests and a commonality of purpose. And so we're all members of various communities. And it doesn't mean that everybody within the community agrees on specific tactics or strategies or issues, but there is this commonality of purpose and long-term goal that kind of pulls them together. And in thinking about what I've been doing with OSI and with Metadata 2020, I think the challenge there has been we're dealing with multiple communities that those of us who are working on these projects believe have broadly shared interests, but that the people within those communities might not recognize. So OSI is a global effort to bring many, many stakeholders together into the discussion about issues around open scholarship. So I talked about that briefly during the opening session this morning. How do you get the conversation to go beyond publishers and librarians, but really bring in the funders and higher ed administrators and researchers and all of the other voices, so that we really are taking advantage of all of the expertise and all of the knowledge and all the background of people who have a stake in this. Metadata 2020 is actually very similar. It's a little bit more focused in what it's trying to do, the goal being to really improve the development use of metadata across all of the entities that develop metadata, that apply it, that use it. And the recognition in Metadata 2020, and I think in OSI, that in order to achieve the very big goals, it becomes necessary to get all of the individual goals of all of those individual groups in alignment. And that becomes really the big challenge, is how do you take communities which so often are perceived as having divergent interests and get them to work together with shared interests. So just looking at the publisher and librarian groups, we are often appear to be on opposite sides of issues. But within OSI and within Metadata 2020, we believe that there are aspects to the long-term goals of those communities that we share. So how do we identify those goals? How do we pull people together, get them to understand where we have shared goals, so that we can work on those and not let the things that we disagree on get in the way of our working together on the things that we do agree on. Again, with Metadata 2020, it's this issue of working on better, richer metadata. For OSI, it's more open and equitable access to the products of scholarship. In order to deal with this engagement, I think both of these projects have structured in very different ways. MD 2020 has used a very kind of structured approach where they started out by setting up working groups within each of these different communities. So getting a group of librarians together, publishers, data repository managers, platform people, and spending some online discussions with those groups to really try to tease out what are the issues and the problems that you have in dealing with metadata, both in terms of creating it, making use of it, handing it off to other entities, or getting it from them. And then from that process, looked for commonalities and commonalities of problems to then be able to say, oh, you know, you publishers and you librarians, your problems intersect over here. If we can get together and work together on this area, we can come up with something that is going to be helpful for both groups. So by working together on this bigger goal, you're going to be able to achieve your individual goals as well. OSI is, in a sense, trying to do the same thing, but in a much broader and much more diverse manner. So there's a discussion group, there have been some conferences, we're working on developing the website as this sort of clearinghouse, but again, it's trying to create a forum where people are really listening to the views of people from other communities and really trying to understand what those differences are so that you can pull the commonalities together and create this larger community. So I think in both of them, and it touches, I think, the same theme that the others have talked about, is how do you work within one community to bring other communities together to create a larger sense of community across a particular issue and a particular purpose. So my question then is very specific, because among these various communities, the community, which is actually another community of communities, that is the most difficult to get to is the researchers. And when we as librarians or publishers talk about the researchers and we have to connect with the researchers and we have to hear what the researchers are saying, we talk about it as if it's a homogeneous group. And of course, we know that it's not. It's many, many, many disciplines across the sciences and the humanities, all of which tend to be very insular, all of which tend to be very involved in their own issues. And for those of us who have tried to connect with researchers in our discipline as a publisher or as a librarian in whatever institution, we find how difficult that can really be, just from the standpoint of having a shared language to talk about these problems so that we can try to get to the point of saying, we understand what your challenges are, and we think that by working together on this issue, you're going to get your needs better met. So any tactics or ideas that any of you have worked on which you felt have been effective in making connections with researchers is something that I'd really be interested in hearing about.
Great, so thank you very much, Scott. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about that is we're now getting down to that emphasis of the fact that communities are powered by the connections between the people in them. Alice touched on that as well, talking about how important it is to build trust, that you don't usually walk into a room and start asking for something until you've actually formed those founding relationships that mean that people are aligned and ready to give something. And so we're finishing now with Chris Erdman, and the reason that Chris comes next is because he's representing the library Carpentries, and the Carpentries come up a lot in the space that I work in as a really good example of passionate communities, so really very much powered by their members and very active in the things that they do. So Chris works with the community of nearly 2,000 Carpentries instructors that are dedicated to the proliferation of data science skills among researchers. And he coordinates workshops globally and develops the community infrastructure that will facilitate growth.
And it's a good segue after Scott's talk about researchers and how to connect with them. In fact, the Carpentries, you might know it as software carpentry or data carpentry or even library carpentry. We're all one Carpentries. That's something I'll talk about later as one of our challenges. But the way we started was essentially that focus from the research community, seeing a gap in the training that they needed. And it wasn't the kind of training that you'd get at a university, more of that theoretical and then maybe the practical side. Carpentry, really means that tool belt kind of approach, like the practical side of learning data science skills, learning skills that will help you in the lab do your research better, but also, skills that will help you in industry later on, so we see a lot of early career researchers going out into industry and applying all this stuff. So it really started off as a grassroots effort, and it really gathered steam starting in 2015, really, I think, when the Carpentry started forming the nonprofit, arm of the Carpentries. Otherwise, before that, it was very volunteer-led, and now we've, you heard some of the numbers, but we've had about 50,000 learners worldwide. We've done thousands of these workshops that look a lot like that. And we have a set of lessons, a curriculum that has been developed over time based on all this community feedback. And again, most of the people in the community are researchers. The people that are taking these lessons happen to be more early career researchers. That's probably about 70% of the clientele that we have that come in and take these workshops. Just to go to that question of what does community mean for us, again, it's community-led, but I think one of the things that we valued as we were forming as a grassroots movement was, and you see this in general in the wider research community, of building that inclusive community. So one of the things we're very proud of is this our code of conduct. Whenever you go into a workshop, we talk about all the various things that we do to make that a welcoming environment, and we're serious about it. We have a whole structure around reporting anything, and ensuring that the workshops are supportive. And another thing that we've developed over time is this programmatic assessment type of work, where we actually do assessment within the workshops, constant feedback. So we actually use these stickies, these Post-it notes, and and it's part of this formative assessment process where people will use the stickies to signal when they're having issues, or they'll write something down on those stickies, and it's one up, one down. It's one positive, one negative thing that you thought, that you wanted to share about the workshop. So we use that to get better within the workshop, and then we also have surveys that we've built up that we've used over time in these workshops to see that we are having an impact, that we're helping people get to that point where they feel comfortable with these tools, with these approaches. So that's one thing that we've developed as well. Open approaches. A lot of the things we do is open tools, share. All our lesson material is CC BY, and you can actually contribute to it. You don't even have to be an instructor or a member or anything like that. You can be someone from the outside that comes to the lessons and decides, I'd like to take this and use it in my own work, or I want to help them out. I want to contribute and build, make an improvement to their lessons. There's a lot of participation pathways in the carpentry, so you can be, I mentioned you can be an instructor, you can be a host, you can you can be a helper, and you could facilitate the organizational aspects of it, the member side of it. You could contribute to lessons. You can be a part of the community, helping with our community initiatives too. So again, we're researchers primarily, so there's these other things that we're interested in besides the curriculum, besides the training. And again, it's just it's volunteer members of the community, but we're also growing up this nonprofit organization. There's more and more members joining us, so that's creating more and more infrastructure to support these activities. And I think I mentioned this already. Collaborative infrastructure is one thing that we haven't shared. The shared pedagogy. That's what we do when you decide you want to be an instructor, you want to teach these lessons. You learn about pedagogy. You don't learn about the tools. You actually learn about how you teach, and that's a really great thing. In fact, that all these people are certified, and you can trust that they can go into each institution and teach this pedagogy. Trust that they're going to teach this standard curriculum. This line is from my colleague, Tracy Teal. She's the executive director of the Carpentries, and I think it really highlights the challenge of if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go in a lot of different uncoordinated directions at once, go together. And that is just like, we have all these interests in our community, and the great part is the infrastructure that we have allows people to have these conversations about things like, all their different ways, different approaches that we're not considering with data, with software. And those conversations can happen as they ultimately get integrated into the curriculum. So one of the things that we're having discussions about is high performance computing, and how do we develop curriculum around that. And so, there's a lot of different approaches that people want to take, and we have these conversations. We somehow end up on a shared curriculum. But some of the challenges we had are the branding. I mentioned some people really get confused. What is a carpentry? There's data carpentry, there's software carpentry, there's library carpentry, and people get confused by that. And this is something we have to get better at, in talking to people, that we are one. There are multiple paths into the Carpentries. Community alignment, because all these started organically, we internally have to align all these different things and ensure that everyone feels like they're included in this one Carpentries. Lesson development is another one where everyone wants to go off and create a carpentry for this or that, and it's a very difficult process. But the whole idea phase causes a little bit of chaos because people want to do new things. The other challenge is the retention part, which I actually think that we speak to. Like libraries are talking about, and that's not just libraries, but keeping talented individuals that are data savvy. One thing that we do, if we certify people, you know that this person coming from that institution that has Carpentries background will be able to do things over in your lab or your teaching environment if they have the same skill set. I think we speak to that retention problem that we're hearing. And then the path after you take a workshop, the continued learning, is something we have a challenge with, of like, how do we enable people to create that community, that local community? But everyone wants to do data science. That is, we have a lot of people interested in taking the training and doing all these things. You know, we have a lot of shared expertise. I think one thing we're finding is maybe working with societies and consortiums as a way that we can participate, you know, and collaborate with others. Yeah, and I think one of the great things that I'm interested in is library as a hub for these activities, being the centerpiece really for Carpentries activities on a campus. The researchers are telling us they want this. The library should want to be a hub for this. So my question is about professional development. You know, we have, I think, in libraries, but in general, we have all sorts of professional development activities, and I wonder if what approaches you've taken towards that, and what are maybe some unsuccessful approaches as well, because I also like hearing about maybe the failures, but yeah.
So thank you very much, Chris. So one of the things that occurs to me in listening to these is that some of the challenges that these different communities are facing are probably because they're actually at different stages of their evolution. And so I just want to go through the speakers and be like, how old is the community that you've been talking about? How many years has it been going?
OSI has been, we're sort of entering our fourth year. Metadata 2020 is in its second year.
Yeah, okay.
So Chorus is just approaching its fifth year.
And ORCID has just turned 6, and C4 Disc just launched last month, but it was kind of a year and a bit in preparation.
Right.
This is a tough one. It actually started, software carpentry was the original carpentry. It started in 1998, 1999,
Yeah.
and then it built up steam, and I think, again, it got more serious around 2015.
Yeah.
So it took a while to get to that point.
And that's a really good point. I mean, we teach a lot with the community theory that, you know, we've heard a lot here about finding the alignment, finding what it is that people are trying to do together, brokering the common terminology and what the activities are going to be, building trust and so on. And that can take, you know, some time before you then are kind of overwhelmed with more people than you know how to cat herd. So, yeah, that's great. Okay, so as promised, here's a reminder of the 4 questions that the speakers asks that we can now discuss. But I just wanted, before we dive into that conversation, does anybody else have anything that's cropped up for them in listening to the presentations? Anything that you wanted to go a little bit deeper on, or a related question that you want to flag at this point?
What I've seen and have felt is that we have gotten so granular. You know, we were starting professionally as library groups, publisher groups, and now we're getting down into very nitty-gritty, like metadata and, you know, identity, you know, DOI, ORCID. So it's great, but it just shows the evolution and the complexity of the world in which we've moved to. And I keep thinking, what will the next wave be?
Mhm.
Will we go back to more simple groups that will be like just librarian? You know, I just don't know. Rather, we're in the middle of a pendulum swing from simple, it seems simple, those are the good old days, right? To the current complexity, to the more simple again. I don't know.
Yep. Thank you, Howard.
Thanks for saying what you said, Jean. in my career, I've worked for a number of membership organizations, as well as commercial publishers and blah, blah, blah. What's interesting is, given the situation, and Howard will certainly correct me if I'm wrong, I've only been doing it a couple of months, but what is coming forward in terms of my learning are the working groups, right? And without going into the history of Chorus and how it developed and it's new, is I'm juxtaposing work I've done with NISO. It's much more complicated than Chorus could ever hope to be, I guess, in terms of the different kinds of players. And what I've learned from them is the enormous impact that the working groups have, the institutional ones, and the publishing, the technology space. And I know that Chorus is moving more in that direction as it's been evolving. But what I've seen from the various groups I've been involved with is the managing of it is not easy. You know, people volunteer, and I call them resume volunteers a lot of times. They just want their name on the resume. But there's a lot of work that goes into, and you know, and it's technology. It's not feel-good stuff. It's not a trade association. So I think if there's anything that I've learned in learning is a good group of dedicated, passionate, whatever the working group is that you need, but it needs attention and management, or whatever you want to say, and nurturing. So that's something that I've learned, and it is complicated because we are getting granular. One of the things I talked to about Howard yesterday too, I've now discovered the research community like I'd never had to work with them before. So there you go. You know, how far can you go when you're limited also in terms of resources and not getting too granular? So it's all fascinating.
So yeah, +1 absolutely to this notion that you actually need people doing the human work of helping these groups, working groups, work together. That's why we run a fellowship program to train them, because more and more people are starting to see that it doesn't just happen magically by itself. I think, and the other thing, just an observation, not sort of bringing together what both of you have said, is that I think we're hearing like more and more now about working groups and about people using the terminology of communities of practice, this notion of bringing folks together from different areas to nurture and cultivate knowledge together in a way that they wouldn't be able to do on their own. And I think I'm having that reflected back from various different spaces, and I know that's something very much part of what ORCID's doing at the moment as well. Okay, so let's tackle these 4 questions then. So let's start with Howard. So his question was, what was the best outcome of a community-led effort, and why was it successful? So yeah, did you have anything in mind? And what can you think of an example of this to kick us off?
So for me, I mean, I can speak of many, but the first one I would say was probably Crossref, because you had a specific goal that the publishers wanted to solve. They wanted at the time, back in the late 90s, they wanted to be able to solve an issue where many publishers were trying to make agreements between each one of them so that they can do linking from the articles to another article from their references. And they were doing this over and over and over again. And so Crossref really started, actually a pilot project that I led into this concept of could we do it together in a common database and make it so much more efficient. And then Crossref has then blossomed into other various different projects, because once you had this persistent identifier that was then useful, this community could then stretch out. So it started as publishers, now funders are involved, and institutions are very much involved, and to me this has been a really success story.
So any of the other speakers want to talk about successes perhaps they've seen or observed through their own work?
I'm going to say ORCID actually, which is in part thanks to Howard. But you know, I actually think I joined ORCID 3.5 years ago, so I can't take any of the credit for the kickoff, which was really wonderfully well done. But you know, I came to ORCID from a very different kind of organisation, a big commercial publisher, and one of the things that really struck me was there are many passionate people working in scholarly publishing right across the board, but I think the shared passion of, as Howard said, having a common goal that bridges across many different organisations and individuals and communities is something that's quite rare, and when you come across it, it's really, really powerful and a wonderful thing to be involved in. And I think Crossref was a great example, and I think ORCID is another one actually, even though I do say so myself.
And that's back to one of those original quotes of, the momentum that we get when we actually align with that purpose. Really enables us to propel on. We see that in our fellowship program, that we're bringing together these people who are building communities, and they've had no curriculum, they've had no training in how to do this. They've just ended up in these roles and are self-confessed, kind of making it up as they go along. And once they've actually been given frameworks and access to each other, suddenly they're all so much more empowered. Quarter of the class got promotions as a result of taking part in the program and so on. So you really see this momentum because of the fact that they're existing as a community of professionals connecting with each other. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, are we done?
Sure.
I can just, I just thought of one too. That sometimes it's interesting how you just need to connect a few of the dots for something to work. And one thing that came to mind was that it may not be all the communities, but there are certainly definitely certain communities that feel strongly about research software, that want to get credit for it, and they want the importance of it to be elevated. They want it to be elevated in the whole research credit process, and so I think we saw this. I used to work in astrophysics, and we saw this in having the ability to connect the dots. So most of the astrophysicists use a system called the NASA the NASA ADS, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. But they use that for their literature searches, and so being able to connect that with another service called Zenodo to be able to mint DOIs, preserve their software, we've seen just a dramatic rise in people using that to credit their software and to help with the discovery of it. And I looked at the numbers not too long ago, and because I responded on a PubPub article by MIT Libraries, where I mentioned that at their institution it shot up the deposits of software, but in general in the worldwide community, it went from like 2015 to like maybe 1,000 or something. I can't remember the exact, but then it shot up to, by this point in 2018, to 60,000 plus, deposits. So it's just connecting some of those dots and seeing, how things come. And the community part was that all the astrophysicists were telling themselves, they were on social media saying, hey, use this, do this. And they had that simple description, the GitHub 10-minute article on how to do it. And they were just sharing it back and forth with each other and became advocates, so.
So I think segueing from this notion of identifying that shared need, that shared purpose that can really act as the engine for a community, to Alice's question about how can we get better at bringing existing communities together, I'm just wondering, sort of throwing it out to you, as you think about the communities that you belong to, is it apparent what that shared need is? Like, do you feel that compulsion, that momentum? Or if you're trying to convene a community, are you still trying to figure out what that is? Anybody got any reflections on what that looks like?
I've had the privilege this year to work with a group of librarians of a library school and in Elsevier as a publisher, vendor, information analytic company, to work toward a common goal of teaching research data management services and skills, primarily librarians, but also to researchers. Chris and I have talked about it. So what we did was each of these three partners had a need. The librarians had been trying to get funding from national agencies, government agencies, and had been unsuccessful. I wanted to create the opportunity for librarians to be engaged in this part of the ecosystem, and like you said, had the library as a hub for data awareness and education within your institutions, but feeling that some comfort had to be given to those librarians to really engage in that space. And then the third, the library school, was looking at creating a new, re-energizing their continuing education credit course. So from 3 separate little, somewhat common needs, but separate granular needs, we'll go back to that word, we got together and are producing online modules funded by Elsevier, created by the librarians, the peer group, and then supported for accreditation by the library school. So we were able to make everyone's individual need and pain point be met, but through the synergy, it's going to be much more successful because it will engage even communities beyond the original intended community. And it was very fun to just see people spark when they were like, oh, we can be part of this new community of 3 separate in the past entities into one. So I think those kind of moments are rare but great when they happen.
Most definitely. Yeah. So anybody got any reflections on this question then of bringing existing communities together rather than creating new ones? I mean, it sounds like, sometimes we do need new ones. Sometimes it is finding that unique sort of overlap in the Venn, but what about not kind of reinventing the flat tire all the time? Yeah, go for it.
So I think part of this has to do with the sort of responsiveness that's been required of these communities towards these problems that we're facing. So kind of like putting something together because there's a required responsiveness because of it's a problem that absolutely needs to be solved by these other communities that we work with. And I wonder if as we solve these problems, if you think that these communities that we've created will be able to merge together to kind of solve those then maybe like peripheral problems to each other. Like as you solve metadata issues and make them more normalized, do you think that those communities can then merge with another community that is maybe trying to work on inclusiveness?
Yeah, I wonder if Scott's got perspective on this.
That actually goes back to a conversation that Howard and I were having just before this session about what might happen with metadata 2020 over the course of the next year and when it really comes to its conclusion. Because we have on any day sort of grandiose goals for what metadata 2020 might achieve, and on any other day we're thinking, I'm not quite sure what we're doing. And come to the end of 2019, we're going to close down that project. And we will have achieved some stuff, and hopefully that will be a good thing. But one of the things that we will have achieved is connections that weren't there before. And I think Howard was talking about connecting with people outside of the publishing space that he's so familiar with and recognizing that they have similar problems and that they have expertise that can help him deal with his problems, and that he's got expertise that can help them deal. So there are these additional interlinked communities being created out of these collaborative activities that are, I think, going to go on with their own momentum and find new ways of addressing some of those shared problems.
So we're running short on time now, so I just want to take a quick chance to tackle questions 3 and 4. So question 3 was about the tactics for making connections with researchers specifically, and question 4 was asking about successful or unsuccessful professional development approaches in a community. So I wonder if anybody had examples here that they, or just comments, further questions that they wanted to make about these.
But I thought it was really interesting how you're talking about finding commonalities between groups. But I think it's also worthwhile to think about the commonalities within groups too. So like research is a very disparate group of people that sort of inhabit a bunch of different spaces, but they all have one goal, which is to do their research. And so trying to emphasize that in marketing to researchers, I think might be more helpful than trying to market any sort of degree of granularity of offering. I don't know. That's not tactical, but I thought it was a really cool question.
I think engaging with them. And yesterday, we had a pre-conference where we had researchers come in and speak about their needs to librarians, and librarians respond and talk. And afterwards, both of the researchers that were there said, we just need to do this more often. We need to talk. We need to cross-pollinate conferences because we talk to ourselves often. So I think inviting them to our conferences would be great.
Great. So, yeah, one more comment.
Sorry to chime. So to Scott's question, a lot of my position at Purdue is outreach for open access and outreach to faculty and really assessing their needs and how can libraries meet their needs if I'm not the person who's another specialist in the library that can help meet that need. So I'm young, I'm green, I'm still new at this, but I also come from a family of fishermen. So I look at my job as I have a tackle box full of things, and whatever I can get people to bite on, that's how I bring them into my space or I meet them in their space and we have a wider conversation. I feel like a lot of what I do is fishing and just gathering information, and I'm sort of that hub to connect people elsewhere.
Making a net for the network. Yep, very nice. Okay, so we are sadly out of time now. So I want to say thank you very much to our speakers for their presentations, and thank you very much for a good discussion. If anybody wants to continue this afterwards, I'm sure we can get coffee. Thank you.
Thank you.